The last thing I want to add to the hot air balloon is a basket, 'cause I think it's kind of an interesting, simple example. So a basket, I'm going to start with a box. And it should actually be a hollow box. So I'm going to use onion again, and that's going to give me, it's going to round the corners as it does the onion. So I don't need to round it there. If we didn't want that, we could set a negative R value. And you can't really tell what onion did unless you remember from the first video. So I'm going to intersect it with, subtract a half space. So this is space that I used this before without really explaining it. It's a shape that takes up all of the positive y axis, and I can set an offset to like move it upwards, so this moves it along this axis. So here you can see the onion, and I don't like the negative radius. I like that it's round, and the top's not round because I did this subtraction that was very hard. So I can add a radius to the subtraction and get this nice, soft basket. Maybe there. Okay. But this isn't my basket. I want it to be kind of scooped. I want it to be this kind of natural shape instead of this flat box. So there's a couple things. I think instead of a just flat box, I want to subtract out a paraboloid. So to get a paraboloid, instead of 40, I'm going to say 40 plus, and what I want to do is take p dot x um, and square it. Okay, and that gives me this, but I want, oops, give me p dot x over 100 over 10, and I'll pick a value here. Okay, and you can see my, this needs to come a little bit lower so that it subtracts the whole top surface. Okay, that looks pretty good. But I want to do the same thing in the z direction. So p dot xz, and we'll square that. So that's going to square the x and the z components. And then I'll just take the sum of it at the end to add the x, y, and z components of this, or sorry, the x and y components of this two-dimensional vector. And that gives me a parabola in a paraboloid instead of a parabola. I can try showing you what this shape looks like by itself, but I feel like it's gonna be, yeah, you can kind of tell. Uh, it's, I'll move it down. Yeah, so it's a three-dimensional paraboloid. Don't worry about it too much. Okay, so that's basically a box. Now I want to add a little bit of texture to it, and this is like the fun part of STFs, I think. So I'm gonna use offset, and this is just gonna like bump out by an amount, but I'm going to bump it out by a sine of the x value. Okay, so that's so it adds these little ridges, pretty good already. I'm gonna add also a sine of z. Okay, that's pretty good. So, oh, but I don't really like that. So I'm gonna take p dot xz, and I'm gonna take the sine of this, and instead of xz, I'm gonna take the minimum of x and z. Is that? And I'm going to take the absolute value. Okay, I like that. So that gets me a pretty good ridge surface. And I'm going to multiply this by 2, 3 to make it like more, whoops, wrong thing. Problem with using the infix notation. Okay, so higher frequency. And actually, I'm going to make it less severe. Good. Ooh, you can see this, there's this discontinuity here because I shouldn't be using sine, I should be using cosine so that it's symmetrical. Okay. That looks pretty good. And now I'm going to add to this sine of p dot y. I'm going to do the same period, I think. So p dot y times 3. Beautiful. And I'm going to move the scaling factor to the very end. So like that. And I didn't think this would happen. Okay, so I'm getting like moire effects because it's not anti-aliased, but these wouldn't actually show up if you rendered this with anti-aliasing. So this doesn't look amazing. I want to take, instead of just the sign, let's take the absolute value. Moire intensifies. Let's do that over here too, I think. Gives me, yeah, okay. It gives me this kind of ridges. This isn't really good though. I feel like, yeah, okay. So that kind of gives me more of like a baskety vibe. And then something that I could do is when I have this cosine, I could offset the period of it by, let's say, clamp the sine of p dot y. And what am I doing? Clamp it at 0. So it's gonna just alternate between 0 and 1. And I'm gonna add that signal. Sorry, I don't mean clamp, I mean step. Step this value up at 0, and then sort of, and then multiply the whole thing by pi over 2, I think. So what did that do? Yeah, so that like offset it a little bit. I feel like this might actually look good. If I don't do the whole amount, but like 2 times it. Yeah, so that way I kind of get these like, I don't know, you get like a basket weave effect. That's kind of what I'm going for. It looks bad on the bottom because I didn't do any kind of similar stuff here. You could use spatial symmetry. You could make this offset effect and like make it symmetric in X, Y, and Z, but whatever. The moire effect intensifies. So that's pretty good. I'm gonna shade it now with kind of a tan color. What do you think yellow is? Like 0.1? And not very saturated, but pretty bright. That's, kind of close. It's a 100 moon basket. A little bit warmer and more saturated, but darker? No, I liked it better before. Bright, saturated. Yeah, so it's like a wicker. That's kind of what I'm going for. Um, oh, and you can see when you look at it from straight down, you can see the paraboloid's causing some problems with the distance field from this angle. The rays are overshooting slightly, but that's okay, because we're not going to see it from that angle. We're especially not going to see it because I'm going to add some handholds to this. So I'm going to add a box that is, this is 50, so 50, maybe 5 and 10. Good, and I'm going to move it 50 in the z direction, and in the y direction certainly. So 50, 0, 50, 50, yeah. Okay, so 55. So this is going to be like a handhold for me. And I'm going to make it a little bit wider. And I'm going to distort it with the exact same parabola distortion that I did before. I'm just going to copy this because I'm lazy. And I'm going to add it here. But I'm only going to, it's kind of cool, this like 3D effect, but I really only want it in the X direction. So that gives me a parabola that, I could have made a variable for this. I just copied and pasted it, whatever. So it sticks off, obviously, but that's not going to be a problem because we're going to mirror it. And this is kind of annoyingly difficult because I want to mirror it in 2 directions at once. I haven't really made a good combinator for this yet, so what we're going to do is rotate it by 45 degrees and then mirror it across the z-axis. I do this negative. It's like kind of tricky because, yeah, okay. And then rotate it back. Okay, so I have this mirrored handholds, and these are obviously too sharp. You'd cut yourself on those. That's pretty good. They're a little bit sharp on the corners, so I'm going to add a radius to the mirror, and this mirror is just taking an absolute value of space. When you add a radius, it switches from an absolute value to a biased square root, so it gives you this nice, like, smooth 10, and then I'll move it up. Yeah, kind of. See, it's yeah, this is absolutely fine for what we're gonna see this as. So I'm gonna shade this with like maybe like a slightly dark maroonish. Is that maroon? What do we call this maroon? Sure. Burgundy. Burgundy, kind of a low gloss, high shine type thing. That's gross looking. Sure. Sure. It doesn't look good, but the lighting is pretty bad in general. The whole thing, I'm gonna add just a little bit Fresnel. No, just to this. Just to this. The basket shouldn't have Fresnel. It's too noisy. So that gives it kind of this kind of whatever. I'm gonna call this the basket. Basket. And I'm going to add this to the rest of the scene. So union basket. I'm going to scale it down to 0.5 and move it down like 100, 200. That's in the fire. So once again, slow to recompile this. That's still too big. How big is a basket relative to the balloon? Like that big? It's got quite a fire. So I think that's the interesting parts of modeling a hot air balloon. I think texturing the basket is fun. The infinite repetition stuff and the flame is fun. Oh, one thing that we can do with this scene, now that we have the flame and the hot air balloon together, is we can speed things up a little bit by changing the way that we use the flame. So I created the flame using this offset function. And let's just look at the flame again. So just by itself, this is my flame. And we're using the offset with this noise function. And the noise is really expensive. And the way the Bobble works right now is the only way that it can calculate normals, which it uses for shading, is to evaluate the entire distance field. And the distance field that requires now evaluating this parallel noise, even though most of the pixels that we're shading are on the envelope of the hot air balloon, and the normals there are not going to be affected in any way by the flame. Bobble doesn't know that. So let's tell Bobble that by changing offset to, that's the basket again, changing offset to offset bound. And sorry, bounded offset. And what this is going to do is it's going to break out this multiplication to a separate number. Okay, and what this actually did, it looks exactly the same, which is what we want. But if we look over here, this is, we can kind of see the ghost of the bound because we can see this is showing us the number of ray marching steps that it took. And you can see that the boundary increased the number of ray marching steps because the way the boundary works is the ray marcher will approach the boundary, and then once it gets within a certain threshold distance from the boundary, it will then approach the shape inside of it. So the rays kind of slow down as they get to the boundary, and once they punch through, they slow down as they get to the actual shape. And we can increase the threshold to reduce the cost of the boundary by just essentially making it larger. Um, but for something like this, that's going to work just fine. And when we add this back to the rest of the scene, everything is faster because when it shades and calculates the normals, it doesn't have to evaluate the fire. So we can, render this in real time. So where do we go from here? I'm going to add some Fresnel to the balloon. I should have done this in the very beginning. It's going to look so much better with a little bit of that. Just give it a little bit of fun. Accentuates the curves a bit better. Everything has a little bit of Fresnel reflectivity in real life, and these are nowhere near like physically accurate shaders that I'm using, but everything looks better with a little bit added to it, I think. But don't listen to me because I don't really know what I'm doing here. So pretty good flame that you only see if you look from the bottom. And the basket that is giving us horrible moire, but that will all disappear if we render this with anti-aliasing, which we can't because Bobble doesn't support that yet, but it's coming in a future update. I think that's where I'm going to leave this. So we could add ropes and, something to hold the torch would be a very reasonable thing to ask for, but I think it's in pretty good hands. Um, so the Fresnel doesn't like this really sharp surface that I did this cutoff because when it does the normal approximation, it really doesn't work well with sharp surfaces. Normals will give you kind of crazy values. So I'm just going to round that slightly. I don't know how well you can tell, but that's going to cause the normals to be much nicer. So all looks better. Um, yeah, I think that's it. I think that's where I'm going to leave this. I'm going to keep adding stuff to it myself, add like some ropes, and the envelope should probably be held by like a metal something, but that's all the interesting bits to talk about.